Thank you, Frank. Good morning to our audience. When John Kennedy and Richard Nixon ran for president in 1960, they agreed in the debate they had that Red China was a serious threat to the United States. Kennedy had written a book called While England Slept, describing the failure of the free world to recognize the threat, the rising threat, from Nazi Germany in the 1930s and early 1940s. The question today for us is, why have so many people been so wrong about China for so long? After 40 years of American engagement policy, government officials and foreign policy experts are discovering a very real China threat coming at us from several directions: economic, diplomatic, ideological, and most seriously, militarily. But we should not deceive ourselves. The threat has been there for all this time. It has just grown so large and so real that it can no longer be ignored, dismissed, or papered over with wishful thinking. To understand where we are and how we got into this predicament, dangerous as it is important to return to when it all started, with then President Nixon's opening to China in 1972. Before he began that initiative, and as he was launching his second presidential campaign, Nixon had published a foreign affairs article laying out what he hoped to accomplish as president with China. The year was 1967. Mao Zedong was in the middle of his Cultural Revolution and Great Leap Forward, in which 50 million Chinese died. The United States and China had already fought a 3-year war after North Korea and China had invaded South Korea. China had also invaded and occupied Tibet and East Turkestan, now called Xinjiang province. And Chinese communist forces were at that very time killing Americans in South Vietnam, with both China and the Soviet Union providing the weapons and supplies to keep the war going indefinitely. China was a declared enemy of the United States and the entire Western world, and was actively fomenting wars of national liberation throughout Asia, Africa, and Latin America. That was the China Nixon knew he would confront after he won the presidency. And he was determined to do something about it, to change the perilous spiral we were on with China, or rather that China was on with the entire civilized world. He argued American policy must urgently recognize the present and potential danger from communist China and take measures to deal with that danger. Nixon foresaw a dire future for the world if things did not change and China was not brought into the international community. He said, "We simply cannot afford to leave China forever outside the family of nations, there to nurture its fantasies, cherish its hates, and threaten its neighbors. There is no place on this small planet for 1 billion of its potentially most able people to live in angry isolation." Nixon said it was essential to persuade China that it must change, that it cannot satisfy its imperial ambitions, and must turn away from foreign adventuring. He warned, the world cannot be safe until China changes. But he said there were right and wrong ways to get China to change. He rejected the idea of conceding to China a sphere of influence in the Asian mainland and extending even to the islands beyond. He said neither the United States, as an Asian power, nor its regional allies could accept that outcome. Next, Nixon ruled out preemptive war, which he said could escalate into World War III. He also warned against making unilateral concessions to accommodate China, as he put it, rushing to grant recognition to Peking, to admit it to the United Nations, and ply it with offers of trade, all of which would serve to confirm its rulers in their present course. Instead, Nixon said, America needs a policy of firm restraint, of no reward or a creative counterpressure designed to persuade Beijing that its interests can only be served by accepting the basic rules of international civility. He called it a policy of dynamic detoxification, both to keep the peace and to help draw out the poison from the thoughts of Mao. The question is, when Nixon finally became president and had the opportunity to put those principles into effect, did he follow them, dealing with China and getting it to change its attitudes toward the outside world? It is worth noting that Nixon's junior partner in the China opening, his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, did not share the president's urgent desire for communist China to change its policies. Though the former Harvard professor had never devoted any of his professional career to China, his only interest was in playing the so-called China card against the Soviet Union for the sake of détente. He also wanted China to help the United States achieve a face-saving withdrawal from the war in Vietnam. Nixon put Kissinger in charge of negotiating the terms of his visit to China, but he cautioned him, quote, "We cannot be too forthcoming in terms of what America will do. We'll withdraw from Taiwan, and we'll do this, and we'll do that, and other things," unquote. Yet in the end, the two realists did exactly that. In return for promises on Vietnam that were never fulfilled and a Soviet détente that never worked, the U.S. began making concessions. Even before Nixon went to China, it withdrew its forces from Taiwan, pulled the 7th Fleet out of the Taiwan Strait, where it had been since the Korean War, and agreed to switch U.S. diplomatic relations from Taiwan to Communist China in Nixon's expected second term. The Shanghai Communique, the original sin of U.S.-China relations, contained ambiguous language about one China that Beijing has used ever since to falsely claim Washington agrees that Taiwan is part of China. When Mao said he could wait 100 years before using force against Taiwan, Kissinger asked why he would wait so long. That set the pattern of accommodationist U.S.-China policy for the next 4 decades. Years later, Nixon, seeing no change in Beijing's anti-Western behavior, expressed regrets at what he had accomplished, saying, "We may have created a Frankenstein." He also said democratic Taiwan is permanently separated from China. Kissinger, however, has built his entire post-government career on the original deal, advising both Chinese and American leaders to stick with it. He has publicly warned Taiwan that China will not wait forever. President Jimmy Carter in 1979 completed the Nixon-Kissinger plan to officially abandon Taiwan. An outraged Congress quickly passed the Taiwan Relations Act, committing the U.S. to maintain unofficial relations and sell arms for Taiwan's self-defense. The TRA also said it would consider any threat to regional stability as a matter of grave concern, though it did not specifically pledge the U.S. to come to Taiwan's defense. An opportunity to clarify America's commitment came in 1995-96, when China showed its displeasure at Taiwan's first direct presidential election by firing missiles across the Taiwan Strait. President Clinton initially sent an aircraft carrier, but backed off when Beijing said U.S. ships would face a sea of fire. Chinese military officials asked Assistant Secretary of State Joseph Nye what the U.S. would do if China actually attacked Taiwan. Instead of referring to the Taiwan Relations Act to show America's commitment to a secure Taiwan, Nye said, quote, "We don't know and you don't know. It would depend on the circumstances." That statement of strategic ambiguity has been U.S. policy ever since. Beijing took great encouragement from the answer. It devoted the next 25 years to building a massive military to create the circumstances that would deter Washington from intervening when China attacked Taiwan. It includes an arsenal of attack submarines and anti-ship ballistic missiles to keep the Seventh Fleet away. A Chinese admiral recently said, sinking a U.S. carrier or two would kill 5,000 to 10,000 sailors and teach America a lesson. To a large extent, the strategy has worked. Until the Trump administration, the U.S. Navy has mostly kept out of the Taiwan Strait and ignored China's massive island-building campaign and militarization in the South China Sea, which Beijing now claims as its territorial waters, despite a United Nations ruling against it. Chinese ruler Xi Jinping has been blatant in asserting Beijing's claims also in the East China Sea and through his Belt and Road Initiative in Central Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. He says China is merely reestablishing the ancient Silk Road trade routes, but Xi is actually using China's economic power to entangle poor countries in debt traps and security arrangements that end up extending China's strategic power globally. It should be remembered that his predecessor, Deng Xiaoping, advocated a deceptive Machiavellian strategy for China as it built up its economic and military power. He instructed Chinese officials, hide your capabilities and bide your time. Western experts thought Deng was a charming and clever little fellow, but they never bothered to ask what he was hiding and what China was biding its time for. Xi Jinping has torn off the mask and revealed for all to see in his China dream that Communist China's aggressive ambitions have never ameliorated, never changed or gone away. After 4 decades of generous Western engagement, investment, and technology transfer, it is still, as Nixon first described it, a regime with imperial ambitions. Despite being inside the family of nations now, it still, in Nixon's words, nurtures its fantasies, cherishes its hates, and threatens its neighbors. Whoever the next commander-in-chief is, he or she will face the same hostile adversary Nixon did. But thanks to misguided U.S. policies over that time, it will be a far more powerful and dangerous one. Thank you.
Thank you,